We don't know if Tony's going to join, but it's 4:32. We are going to call to order, and don't have any citizens to be heard. My children. And we don't have any public hearings, but are there any ex parte communications to share? So this is the okay, so we will go to approval of meeting minutes from April 11th. Not today, it just feels off. It's like the weather doing this. Sudden, yeah. Has everyone had a chance to review the meeting minutes? And are there any comments? Is there a motion to approve the minutes? Motion by Rick, seconded by? Seconded by Makeda to approve the meeting minutes from April 11th. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. Steve?
Aye. Aye.
Aye. I can see the okay, thank you. So those are approved. We'll move on to county commission updates.
Okay, so I just have a couple things. At the April 19th meeting, we had the first water information presentation by Mark Stilson. I sent you guys the PowerPoint on that. Yeah, you're welcome. There's also the video. If you go to the Grand County, Agenda Center, you can watch his presentation. But I think it was awesome, and I think it's just great. Hopefully, it'll gain more steam as we move along. The goal is to have it quarterly, and the next time he was going to talk about the Colorado River Compact. So that's great. So that's a great segue into the Colorado River Authority Advisory Council. So we are not actually represented on that advisory council, and that Mark it's great because he facilitated that we are going to be able to be represented. I mean, it's pretty bad that we're not, and that's Grand and San Juan County. So it's not like a little void, it's a fairly large void. So that being said, they're having this advisory council. It pertains to citizens, stakeholders, experts. They gather information, study and analyze, and provide diverse perspectives. The goal is they want people to apply for that position. We're a part of the Central region, which is a little weird. So Daggett, Duchesne, Uinta, Carbon, Emory, and Grand counties. There'll be 7 to 9 members on each council. They'll meet 4 times a year, and they are soliciting, as of today, applications. However, I got on their site and I couldn't find the application, so I'm not sure how they're going to take applications. I did email them to request an application, and I'll send that out.
Is that at the state level?
Yeah, it's at the state level, yeah. So that's really great. And then the last thing that I think was of interest from that meeting was this disposal of real properties in San Juan County. So basically we have 4 properties in San Juan County. We're just going through the process of being able to dispose of them. We're not disposing of them. We're getting lots of pushback right now, but just the ability, if we wanted to, we could. And the idea that the commission has discussed is, could we better, if we sold, let's say, a 40-acre parcel, take that money and infuse it into a parcel that we own closer to town, affordable housing, for example. So that was really just the ideas surrounding that. One parcel is a strange, like, triangle right on 191. It's like a little over an acre. It's really an odd parcel. One thing that Dana from Groundwater and Sewer mentioned about that parcel, would be really hard to get water to it. We have a 40-acre parcel that's the motor track, right? So that's a pretty big piece of land, and also, really positioned nicely as far as transportation, et cetera, and so on. There's a 20-acre parcel on the old airstrip. That's what I can't remember. So anyways, it's just this idea that if we wanted to dispose of them, could we? I don't know that question. Oh, so I'll ask that question. That's a great question. Why do we not think of those things? Yeah, a swap. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Or at least even adjacent to.
Yep, great. Good statement. The one thing that Dana brought to light was, I'll try not to get into the weeds here, but Pack Creek basically goes, you guys might know this, goes underground. As soon as it kind of goes underneath the bridge, right? Goes underground. I mean, there's a small diversion that feeds like 4 properties farther down the valley. When Pack Creek runs, it's feasible that we could do a change application, gather that water, and exchange it for some of our Colorado River rights, right? And what we would do is take it and put it into an old gravel pit, and then in theory, it's recharging our aquifer. There are a couple gravel pits out there, but they're private and they're not used. But one thing that Dana mentioned is maybe we should retain that 40 acres as a possible, site where we could be recharging water. So it was a great thought. Right. No, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so thanks. So that's it. That's all I got.
Sorry.
Oh, Tony.
Hi, Tony.
Don't ask me a hard question, please.
Not a hard question, just something to think about on the discussion of water rights. I'm no engineer, and I know I'm at my office, right? But I'm not with DNR in this meeting.
Right.
I would proceed cautiously about exchanging out of Colorado River water rights.
Right, okay.
Those are primo water rights.
Right.
I know Pack Creek is valuable to us,
Right.
but Colorado water rights are an endangered species, right? So.
Right, and this is all kind of big theory, these are just big ideas, and that's why we're trying to get that gauge on Pack Creek too, because the reality is we have no idea really how much water flows through Pack Creek, how much goes underground. We have no idea. So that's the great thing about getting that gauge on. And then we might say after 10 years of data, like there's not enough times that it runs where we could actually capture water. Does that make sense? Like these are just big ideas. And this is really coming off of Cedar City's issues. I don't know if you've read about Cedar, but Cedar's a mess. They have over allotted their water, and they're having to do all kinds of strategies to try to mitigate their disaster. And that's one of them. Right. So, yeah. But a great comment. Thank you, Tony. Okay, that's it. I know we have a lot to talk about, so I'll shut up.
No, I always appreciate it. Would you like to send some paper? Well, welcome. This is Dana. Nice to meet you.
Great. All right. Any other questions for Trish about the County Commission update? Okay, we'll move on to the updated draft language for Article 3.3.2 accessory dwellings code update.
Okay, so I've included in the packet the section of code for ADUs, and this is like the most current version basically of what we've been working on. I'm gonna try to bring it up here too for you guys. But I guess I would just, if you've been able to check it out, if anybody has any initial questions or comments, if you've read through it, there's quite a lot of changes. It's not just addressing the internal dwelling ADUs, but also modifying a lot about the external ADUs and kind of just distinguishing between those. Any questions while I work to get this up?
A question that might be a stupid question. When it says no accessory use or structure shall be established before the principal use or structure to which it is an accessory.
Yeah.
With some of the creative discussions that are happening right now, that includes things like potentially mobile units as ADUs is like one concept. Does this prohibit somebody from like throwing a small home on their lot so they can afford to build
No,
their house? Okay, so
not at
that's,
all.
what would be the case where that would apply?
So what that is saying is if you build your an ADU, like first, it's really your principal dwelling.
That's what I thought.
So you don't call it an ADU until you build the big house, and then you switch that designation so that the big house becomes the primary dwelling and the little one that you built first becomes the ADU.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Specifically talking about, like, if I was building a house and then I built ADU first, I
Right.
my cousin and then was
Yeah.
building my other house.
Exactly. So you're allowed to do that, and it's just kind of clarifying that, yeah. We did try to include the language regarding like the height requirements and setbacks related to height, and so that's kind of something I wanted to maybe check with you guys on, what you thought about how we set that up, because basically we're thinking of ensuring that on smaller lots that you're not going to be seeing ADUs that are over 20 feet. And then also, yeah, that wouldn't be built up on top of a garage. Like, you could have a 2-story, but it couldn't go over 20 feet. So that would be for the small lot residential zoning and multifamily. So smaller lots, basically. So you don't have that sort of fishbowl effect of somebody high up looking right into your neighbors. That was a concern. So we were thinking though that you could do that on lots that were over half an acre. So you'd have a little more space to work with something that would be a little bit higher. What do you think?
Well, the word of today, the phrase of the day is creative thinking. So I'm going to just throw some ideas out there. In areas where lot size is small enough to make it difficult to construct an ADU, whether it was attached interior or exterior, if there was, I'm looking at height, I'm even looking at maximum size. I'd love to see if there's a reason to play around with easing that in exchange for restricted workforce housing and residential housing. So for example, in a neighborhood where you had homes where people might want to loft an ADU, if that was then increasing the number of units available to the workforce, would we want to relax that standard?
Those are kind of slight considerations after doing political housing.
Yeah. Same with size, because like 1,200 square feet is big. You know, I'd actually push that down and then go up for workforce housing.
Yeah, well then the 1,200 square feet is actually measured from the exterior. So when you think of a 1,200 square foot house on like realtor.com, that is a pretty big, but that's measured from the interior. So when you think about the exterior, measuring from the exterior, you're really only getting maybe 1,000, maybe a little less even on the interior.
It's currently 1,000 though in our code.
Right, but we don't define how we measure it. So the building, we've been going back and forth with building on that, and we were originally thinking that would be measured on the inside, but then buildings like that's not our protocol usually for them. They want to see the exterior footprint measurements. So
Still feels big.
yeah, you know, it's
A lot of
Moab,
houses in Moab are 1,000 feet.
right?
Yeah. So even if I understand that it's
Yeah.
exterior, but it's still feels big.
Yeah, I know. I hear you.
And I understand, you know, wanting to have your guest, your mother-in-law, right? Traditionally, sort of what we would call them, you know, having space to live. But if you are creating housing for people whose kids are enrolled in schools, who are working here, or who can demonstrate some sort of residency over, you know, a few years, then I'm much more willing to see us relax to allow for more flexibility in
So what you're basically saying is having two standards, let's say 20 feet if it's not workforce housing, but if it is, I'm sorry, did I say that? You got it. You see what I'm going with that. Vice versa, and if it is It can go 20, and if it's not, they
Maybe,
beyond 20. But then you'd want to come up with a number.
maybe height's the wrong one, but, and yeah, I'm just playing around with like,
Yeah.
where,
We do have some areas where we would be requiring or incentivizing workforce be restricted ADUs in the section here where it says,
yeah.
yeah, so if there's a parcel where the principal dwelling is a secondary residence, that would need to be ADU restricted for workforce housing.
Yes, that I think is fabulous.
That was Steve's idea. Thanks, Steve. And then also, if there's already an existing EADU and then an internal one is allowed, because that's apparently how we're interpreting the state legislation. If there are two ADUs on a parcel, then one of those need to be for workforce housing. So yeah. So that gets to some of those kind of things.
I think what I'm maybe pushing at, and I don't know what the solution is, so, on one hand, we're having conversations about tiny homes, people who are comfortable living in smaller areas, and I think that's fantastic. There's many members of our community who would want that. But I also want to respect the dignity of our workforce and not suggest that like, well, the workforce has to live in smaller units. And so like, if you're going to build an extra ADU, I'm jumping around your comments, but like, if you're going to build an extra ADU, then the one restriction to workforce housing needs to be at least, the larger one, right? Or at least, 80% the size or 90% the size of the other one. I think the more we can center on dignity and privatization of residents, I think the better.
Yeah, we're allowed to do that. I think that's like some more benefits we have for encouraging people. Build. The more incentive they have, the better.
And it's still a revenue source for the person who owns
Exactly.
it. It's just
It's not going to be maybe, yeah. And I know we're just brainstorming right now, so. But if in this scenario, for example, if I was to build an ADU and I was like, great, it's going to be for workforce housing, it's going to be for locals, people like employed here. So it's going to be bigger, it's going to be taller, it's going to be whatever, right? I'm able to build a more standard sized unit. And then in 5 years, I'm like, well, actually, I want to make some more cash. Let me turn it into an overnight rental. How, would that just not be allowed? How would we? Great. Okay, cool.
unless they rent an overnight accommodation.
Great. Yeah, just like thinking about that.
Yeah, and the deed restriction, so the, right at the, underneath occupancy requirements, it's just, it says right in the beginning, a restricted use covenant will be signed and recorded by the owner prior to building permit, and that would include these 4 things, which one of them is that it, that the ADU could never be used for light events, essentially. It has to be, we're gonna increase the 30 consecutive days to be 90 days to make that a little more strict.
Tony and Steve, I can't see you on the screen, so I want to make sure that we leave space for you to comment.
I was sharing this.
Oh,
I think this has turned out really well based on the brainstorming sessions we had and the tweaks we had suggested. I'm really pleased with it.
and Tony, I see you have your hand raised as well. Sorry, I couldn't see you.
Oh, that's fine, guys. We're patient here. I agree. I like the way this turned out. I think accessory dwelling units are a great stopgap on our path to sustainable, affordable housing in the Moab Valley. It is happening by necessity already, and we might as well incentivize and regulate it in appropriate ways where we can, making sure that our workforce has things like running water and heat and a place to cook hot food. I am frankly very concerned with some of the chatter that I hear about workforce camping. That to me is very Elysian, if you know that story. Bothers me quite a deal. let the workers sleep in tents. What the heck? So ADUs are better. I think this looks great. I really appreciate the work that went into it and the work that went into making sure that it can't be taken advantage of, like Makita pointed out. That's all.
Thank you. I do want to point to.
Sorry,
ahead.
Emily, can I cut you off real quick?
Please do.
I just had one other comment, and it could wait, but just
No,
before we
go
move
for it.
off of
Go
this
ahead.
topic. I think just for the record, just to throw it out there, I think there was, because I was with the working group on this subject, and I think we were originally talking about like making a workforce deed restriction like pretty robust, and we tried to kind of roll that back a little bit in the effort of allowing basically middle-class folks that do live here in Moab to be able to rent it kind of to whoever they wanted, because that's a means of building wealth for the middle class. And we're kind of running out of ways to do that as the middle class. So that was really important. So I think it's great that in this ordinance here, or this section, that the restriction for workforce housing really only comes when it's a secondary homeowner, and I think there's one other qualification in there. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that's something that's been on my radar more recently. Is we're losing our middle class in America, and using the home as an investment is probably the largest way through which most middle-class folks build wealth. And seeing that we're in trying times with housing inventory across the nation being at an all-time low as results from the recession, creating more ways that we can continue to do that is just really important to me. Otherwise, we're going to lose our middle class. So I think this kind of this language here as it's set up, I think it kind of hits multiple targets. If that makes sense. I apologize. I'm still a little bit sick, so I'm a little brain foggy. that was all I had.
Feel better. I want to address section 2B and C, which is permit and design requirements. One of the commissioners, Commissioner Walker, had actually just in the land use session raised this question of, is there a reason that we would want to relax the requirement that ADUs be permanent structures? And that's a spectrum of possibilities. And I'll just go ahead and start by acknowledging the fact that there is a very real concern across our county about illegal nightly rentals, particularly illegal camping in our neighborhoods. And I realize there would be an enforcement question. So, with that in mind, though, I think we have examples of tasteful, non-permanent structures being used. There was one, the edge of the desert campground. I think those are trailers, yes, but still very tasteful. And there's other examples, and the general quality and sort of design of these various tiny homes, mobile units, mobile structures has evolved. One of the comments that was raised in this last session was the fact that it can be cost prohibitive for people to construct a permanent structure on their property, considering that you have to then bring water and electric and so on, whereas a trailer RV could have some degree of self-sufficiency through tanks and so on. I don't know that we need to find the answer tonight, but I do think it would be wonderful to just get some conversation and direction for staff to explore before bringing this back to us.
I think inevitably, this is my opinion, I think if you were going to allow RVs or whatever you want to call them, I think you need to have the infrastructure. I think you need to have hookups. That's my, and I think that also allows groundwater and sewer to know how much water is being consumed, how many hookups. So I that's just my opinion. I think would need to have hookups, because you need to have, the reality is, if you're talking about semi-permanent and then tanks, but they're gonna go have to dump those tanks. So the reality is, like, to just have hookups and have that ability to.
Because there's plenty of those already.
Yeah.
That's what people are complaining about.
Yeah, I think the building department would require hookup for something like this, for it to be considered long-term living situation.
Yeah.
Right? They would require it to be the utilities. But it would also would mean that construction costs of, like, putting for your foundation and all that kind of stuff.
And the infrastructure to put in hookups is not tremendous.
Right.
And so it is, a fairly small investment to get maybe a fairly large return. I mean, if you're charging $500 a month, you get a return. I mean, sadly, you know what I'm saying?
I think we'd still want to ensure standard of living. How we manage that and enforce that would need to be discussed with the health department and the building department. But we do have examples of people who live in mobile dwellings long-term, and again, the quality of them is improving. We've got, people who sell their homes and live in RVs year-round. You can have a nice quality of life, but I think that's a question we need to answer. So quick, just poll of the, and Tony, I see your hands, so just one moment. Quick poll of the commission. What is the interest in asking staff to revise this draft for the next meeting to include recognition of a non-permanent option so long as there was infrastructure in place and some standardization to meet health standards, quality of life, and dignity? I'll do table comments and then we'll move to Zoom. If there's any, you don't have to comment.
And what would be the distinguishing, I guess I just want to clarify on, like, the distinguishing factor between, currently you're not allowed to park an RV in front of space house or space driveway. Would that, the distinguishing factor be they've applied for an ADU permit and they have all that hooked up? Is that like kind of the definition of maybe the differentiating? Part of the system. Right.
And Ryan just joined, and actually in a moment, if you don't mind, we're having a conversation loosely about the potential of expanding the definition of ADUs to include non-permanent structures. So the question of health just came up. So we're going to just get comments from the board, and then actually I'd love for you to chime in.
Sorry.
Sure. My comments.
Drawing that line between mobile homes and you can basically say, okay, you're gonna mobile home, you can say, well, take the wheels off and what's going on.
We can't hear you, Rick. Maybe you could lean in towards that mic a little bit more.
Differentiated between the mobile home and the, something permanent. You could require people to take their wheels off and put skirting around something, and they can always convert it back after, but that way it wouldn't give the appearance of a trailer park, not as much. And, they wouldn't be just moving in and out willy-nilly, playing with the rules, because you put in the utilities, trailer parks have utilities. So anyhow, I think there needs to be some kind of a line drawn there still that makes it look more permanent. So.
Tony, Steve?
Yeah, I was going to basically emphasize, you guys got around to it already. If we wanted to expand ADUs to non-permanent facilities, well, I don't know if we're just kind of diving into semantics, is my point. Once you put an RV, you take the wheels off and you put it on hookups. Isn't that a little permanent? So I think the point is, regardless of the nature of it, it needs to meet health standards, and it needs to meet some kind of building standard that is better than like a garden hose in a tent, right? You know, that's running water, but it's not what we're talking about. I don't know how to word that. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a construction person. But we need to have flush toilets, running water, and I think there needs to be hookups, because I don't want to see people in our workforce become dependent on their landlords for things like emptying out their black water tank. You know, it's my landlord's RV, it's my landlord's F-350 that pulls it. I drive a beat up 4Runner with 3 windows broken out. My black water tank is full and my landlord's on their 2-month vacation in Cabo. What do I do? Right? We need to have, they definitely need to be hooked up into the hard line of the grid in order to make it count, right? That's
Steve?
Yeah, I would say just my opinion on this. I mean, obviously, I mean, we have very good reason to be discussing this. Though I would say for ADUs that, you know, non-permanent type vehicles, trailers, that sort of thing, doesn't fit in this section. To me, that is going more into the camping section. So that's kind of where I fall with this, is leaving that sort of change out of ADUs and housing that elsewhere. And I don't mean that to be a kick the can, but I think an ADU is something very, very different than RVs and trailers.
Emily, can I just jump in here for a minute?
Go ahead, John. Yes.
So first of all, from the building code perspective, a park model doesn't conform to the building code. It doesn't meet the structural or wind requirements. A mobile home obviously does. Once you anchor it, because it has to be wind anchored, and you can't just take the wheels off an RV, with all due respect, because it really doesn't conform to the code. I think Tony kind of touched on that. So one of the things that could be considered to tie into what Steve just said is a seasonal use ADU, which is more in the temporary use section. And we were looking at some different variations there. At least I'm not sure if you found any best practices out there, which would be something that's brought in and then brought out kind of thing, but only seasonal. And a park model technically is only seasonal.
So we invited Orion to come and have a conversation with the planning commission, if you don't mind the gem stuff come up. And so the 2 issues on our agenda, and just for anybody who's listening and just for context, at this point, as a recommending body, we are looking towards all potential options to address these pressing issues so that we can come up with the best package of recommendations for the county commission. So none of this is anything, well, the ADU code, there is some requirements from the state related to interior ADUs, but broadly speaking, this conversation is really to learn, to get good ideas and bad ideas, and then be able to devise a recommendation. So the 2 things that are sort of broadly on our packet, the first is this question of ADUs, and then you walked in, we were talking about the potential for recommending that the code be evolved to allow non-permanent dwellings as ADUs. And then later on in the evening, but actually I'd love to get your take on this broadly, a conversation about just maybe we call them mobile dwellings in general, whether those are cars, RVs, or something. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd love to hear open thoughts we should be considering, and then if there's any questions for clarification at a high level, the commission's welcome to chime in.
Yeah. So a lot of the concerns that were just brought up by this group are pretty much already taken care of in health codes. So there's 2 different rules at the state level. There's the recreational vehicle sanitation rule, and then there's the recreational camp rule. And that's all kind of dependent on how many levels of infrastructure are added in there. But at least with the recreational vehicle sanitation rule, if there's they define the camping as two different things: dependent and independent. Independent camping, that's when you have your tanks and all that, you're fully self-contained. Dependent is if you need bathroom facilities or whatever. So anytime an RV park goes in, if they're only catering to those fully self-contained vehicles, they don't have to put in bathhouses. But if they let one person go in there and camp in a tent, they then would need to put in the service buildings with the appropriate number of toilets and showers and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of where that all ends up in it. And I agree with John, like calling an RV or whatever it is that an ADU wouldn't be appropriate because it doesn't fit into all of those building codes. It doesn't have a HUD stamp. It doesn't have any of that stuff. However, I do like the model that Castle Valley Town has adopted. They have a temporary dwelling permit, which allows people to use their RV or whatever on their property, but it's reviewed every 2 years and they have to apply for that permit again. And so part of that permitting process is coming to the health department for signature, and we ensure that they have a sewage disposal plan, access to water, all that kind of thing. Ideally, they would always have a sewer hookup. So oftentimes we'll put in a septic system out there, they hook up to it, they install their well, or they haul water. But it's not always the only option. If they can provide us with a contract with one of the septic pumping companies, the septic pumping companies will service an RV specifically. There's the potential of a holding tank that then is pumped on whatever regular basis. So, or even with some of those, are like we come down, if they provide us documentation saying, we just like camping on our property 2 weeks out of the year, we're just going to haul our trailer back and dump it. That's perfectly reasonable in that situation. But if it's going to be staying there all the time, because then we're going to require better things. And then with that 2-year process or 2-year review, we can always make sure that things are in good shape and we can go do inspections. It's pretty, but the weeds that you might get into, though, is what that definition is, because that's why Castle Valley has yurts. And yurts are a frame-supported membrane structure according to building code.
Okay, so you call that on the list of like.
Yeah, and the problem, and they don't meet, just like an RV, and none of them meet any of the energy codes or any of that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think that there's a way to do this safely, but if they were to just, I like the 2-year permit thing.
First time around,
Right. That's great.
first time around.
So the comment, just sure we got picked up, that's moving it towards you. The comment from Rick was,
You could do the first time around 1 year, and then after that, 2 years. More load on you guys probably, but
Right, and half the time we don't really even need to go on site necessarily. It's just a matter of what is there, but it depends. And we would have to work in closely with the building department too, because if they're putting these utilities in, they're going to need building permits for the power service and potentially for the sewer service and all that. So it's
Castle charging
not much.
inspections.
But we don't receive those funds directly. What we would do is the health department, so I have it built in the fee schedule that we would just charge an hourly rate to through this.
But I assume this would fall under a different umbrella than ADUs.
That might fall in.
Yeah, the
Yeah, it's not an ADU, but it's also not,
Right.
it's a temporary dwelling.
do you know if there are current limits on the number of temporary dwellings allowed on a lot or by lot size?
In Castle, I think they only allow one in Castle Valley, or I think it's whatever you want to write into your ordinance, but
And
I mean,
that's
I
right.
think, yeah, but they write all sorts of crazy things into their rules. in Castle Valley, so.
Well, yeah, I mean, here we could, lots of town very greatly, so it could be based on square acreage and stuff like that. So
Right.
proportionally.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Tony or Steve, conversation.
this, I mean, I've kind of like where I think I'm hearing this go is creating some other section of temporary unit that may not fit concisely under camping. And so maybe there's like a miscellaneous section, but I see the need for this type of solution. And I love that 2-year permitting system. It seems like we've got some really good ideas with how we could move this forward. I think where I'm at right now is thinking, okay, like where's this going to live and what do we need to do to drive this forward?
I also know that Emory County is looking at this exact same issue currently. So, because they've been asking questions too.
Something that if we were to pursue this, we should expect some potential resistance from the legislature, like partnering with Emory on common code standards. Would that be in our best interest? Or is it just
I do not dare to guess what the legislature
That's
is.
fair.
Leave the health department out of it. I might get something through.
Okay, fair enough. Retracted. Tony, it looked like you wanted to say something.
I was just gonna remark that generally, whatever Orion says goes. That's fine. Sounds great. I trust you, bud.
I don't want to get lost in this next item on our agenda, which is with Orion here. There again, loose conversation about all the possibilities that we find good possibilities and make recommendations. So that caveat, there has been some interest in exploring the possibility for particularly private landowners such as employers offering some number of units for workforce housing for their employees. And I know when I was working as a guide, for example, you're out the river 20 days out of the month, the idea of paying for rent for your shoes is sort of silly. And so, living out of our vehicles was the right choice, unless you get gigs up north, so you got to drive to Vernal something. And I'm curious, how would that potentially differ in terms of how we should be thinking about this, and what are the parameters that we should be tracking about, such as lot size, facilities for homes?
Okay. So the Board of Health on January 25th adopted a local housing regulation that puts together the basic that we wrote it based on other health department stuff, just the basic things that have to be provided. So we need to follow those rules. There's also a minimum housing standard book that was created in 1986. It's about that thick, which goes into all the aspects of even just like how many cubic feet of air you need to have in like a dormitory situation per person, and like how much sleeping area and all this stuff. So there's a lot of stuff, resources out there that it's already done that can be looked at. But I do think that knowing how many people per size and all that is important. But I mean, I talked to business owners too. Lots of them are looking at doing just this sort of thing. So, and I'm sure that there's recommendations out there for like dormitories and that sort of style housing.
Questions or comments generally with Orion here? So to play back what I'm hearing.
I do have one quick, and Orion, feel free to pass on this because I don't know how much this might live more with like the building department and Bill. But while you're here, if you could give us a 2-minute rundown on the difference between modular, manufactured, mobile home, trailer, park trailer, because I think there's some importance in understanding the terminology here for this body, because it's confusing. It's a bit of a mess. So if you feel comfortable with that, just a quick overview would be great.
So it is building department stuff, but I've glommed onto all of it. So, RV isn't built to any sort of building code standard or HUD standard. It's an internal industry standard that they build to. A mobile home is essentially so there's manufactured homes and modular homes. A modular home, so a manufactured home comes in on wheels. It's built to HUD standard. Anything that predates 1978 isn't allowed to move anymore. I think it's 78, maybe 76, isn't allowed to move anymore. Anything after that can be. Those manufactured homes also, just like the standard homes that you see in Spanish Valley, a lot of them, those are allowed to move one time. At least according to the banks, they can move from the factory, and then they get placed and they receive a certificate of fixture. And then if they move again, they're no longer financeable. It's just not possible. And then modular home is built to buildings code standard in pieces, inspected by a third party inspector wherever it's built, and then that's brought in and placed. There's very few of those that have come into the Roanoke area that I'm aware of. And then get all of them.
I think so, because like the RV would also.
Yeah.
The trailer.
Yeah.
Or
So
a mobile home, I think is almost kind of like RV.
well, a mobile home like you see in a lot of like the older homes, those are the same as a manufactured home. They were also built to a HUD standard at the time. They should have there's like a placard that gets stuck to them, and then there's like another placard that's usually under the kitchen sink that certifies that this is where it's the certificate of origin, I think. And then there's the HUD placard that gets attached to it. It's VIN number pretty much. But that help?
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and you're spot on with modular. There's not too many of those around, but I kind of brought that up because modular is definitely an emerging industry, and we're going to be seeing a lot more modular building. And they come in on a vehicle, so they look like a mobile home.
Steve, sorry, we're losing you.
Then thank you.
We lost the back half of your comment. Would you put it in the chat, Steve, so we don't lose it, and then we'll just read it into the record? Your internet was, hopefully you can hear me. If we can't hear you, you probably can't hear me, I just realized. Okay, well.
So the other thing that we want to think about too is like the tiny homes that you see, the park model tiny homes, those are no different than an RV. They're not built to a standard, most of them. They just come in on wheels. They just look like a little cabin on wheels. And those are appropriate to put in an RV park, but they aren't built to any of those standards.
Real estate agent, the way I explain it to my customers, manufactured home is built at the factory, has wheels and frame and tongue. Truck backs up to it, hooks up to it, drives it to the location, and then backs it in. And usually they take the wheels off and the tongue off. A modular is built at the factory. The trailer comes in with a truck attached to it. They slide it onto the trailer. They drive it to the property. They slide it onto a foundation. The truck and trailer leave. So the axles and the tongue are never attached to the building. So, and that's considered a stick building in real estate. As opposed to a manufacturer.
Oh, interesting.
So just.
It's the same, and it's same for building code.
Yeah.
Thank you. So let me play back the conversation so far based off of where we started. going back to looking at this question of accessory dwelling units under Article 3 specifically, I raised the question of, under the permit and design requirements, should we be considering non-permanent structures as potential use under this? And what I'm hearing from the conversation is that there are existing ways of potentially accommodating that use that wouldn't require us to adopt that into the land use code and would still be conformant with the building code as written today. And there are local examples of that. So just in terms of direction to staff and going into our next topic, it sounds like this question of what do we call it? A temporary dwelling permit as a potential tool is something to take up during this next section of discussion, and to not direct staff to consider including that in Article 3. So did I capture that correctly? Would anybody like to disagree with that direction to staff?
Except that it could be under Article 3, but it wouldn't be under Section 3.3.
To the
it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Let's first of all, thank you for joining us. You're welcome to stay. Are there any last questions, Rohan?
There's cookies over there.
So exciting.
And the only other question I would think about in this is like, is this going to still be a problem in 5 years? Do we know? I mean, we've got 5,000 plus domiciles in this valley that are on the docket right now. There's 3,000 associated with USU. We've got all these other ones, and then a lot of those are going to be apartments. A lot of them are going to be affordable, but you know, like maybe fill that niche market that we don't have right now. And so it's just something to think about. I think, but either way, people are going to be. But it just came from Swanee Park. There's 20 vans there right now.
I know. Yeah, I live there.
That's also on the docket to discuss.
Yeah, there might be. It might not be needed in 5 years, but it might not be that. And at that point, we're just quite giving temporary dwelling permits.
Yeah.
Who knows? So, just thoughts.
Do you know how much this council uses? I mean, is there quite a few?
Probably sign half a dozen a year.
Okay.
Yeah, quite a few.
So let's do this. I think the topic of 3.3.2 ADUs we've given staff direction. If there's any additional comments for staff to take direction on, let's continue to provide feedback over email, and then we'll track changes and share another update at our next meeting. And let's move on to the next discussion item in our packet, which is related to this. Let's try to figure out how to tee this up effectively, because there's a lot underneath. So first of all, Steve, Tony, since you're not in the room, anything else that you wanted to add on to the Article 3.3.2 before we move on?
Feeling good. Thanks, Emily.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. All right. Okay, so this question of camping is obviously very complicated. So there's a few things that we wanted to cover, and we really mostly wanted to use this time as open discussion and brainstorming to give staff something to work with to start to think about how we go forward. So an example might be this conversation about a temporary dwelling permit as one means of addressing the legitimate interest as well as the community need for camping as a housing option in very specific circumstances. So so there's this question of like short-term campers or van lifers, or when it was raining the other day at Swanee Park, there was 3 open spots and 2 Utah plates on the entire parking corner of Swanee Park. We're just at the beginning of the season, and I'll raise with that one. That is the only overnight accommodation use that we currently do not regulate. We do not require parking, and it by its very nature requires parking, and therefore has an impact with every single person that our infrastructure is not set up to handle. It's more of an impact in the city and the county, but we do have it in the county. Then we have this question of solutions for long-term seasonal workers. And sorry, Tony, I think you made this comment that, you know, there is a real concern about setting the standard, intentionally or not, that, well, this works good enough for our locals, for our workforce, so, you know, just push them to the side. I don't think that that's the intent. Anybody who's entertaining this as a possibility, I haven't heard anybody suggest this as a long-term solution to our workforce housing issue. That said, we do have people in our community who, for a very long time, choose camping, outside living, or non-structured living in order to live their life the way that they want to. We do have seasonal workers in particular. I gave the example of working as a guide. When you are a multi-day guide, you're not in town. You know, I preferred to have the money for my paychecks going in my pocket and not to a landlord that I never saw. We have examples of employers in town providing alternate living means to their employees, and the employers would like to find a way to make that available to their employees and be in compliance. And then we have the real problem of we do have, unfortunately, a displaced part of our community, and whether it's a temporary need or a long-term need, I think we need the ability to respond to crisis situations and have those tools without assuming that they are the long-term solution to crisis. An example would be the number of people and families who were displaced from their home over the past year. I think in one of our meetings, the number of homeless was up to 100 people.
I just went to a meeting, there's 144 that were receiving services, if my memory serves me, and 91% of those have been in situational. They're not chronic.
Right. And I'm going to pair, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, is the group aware the multicultural center is teamed with the library, they have safe outdoor living?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I want to, before we open up discussion, I sent an email over the weekend to Trish, PNC staff, OB, the chair of the city planning commission, and Jacques, the chair of the county commission. I just want to read this. It was just some loose thinking. I'd come across this article that I'll share, and then I actually ended up having a conversation with this person. This man is an advocate for alternative housing, particularly mobile dwellings. He lives in the Pacific Northwest, but he has dedicated his life to looking at the spectrum of mobile dwellings and the spectrum of people who do not live in traditional permanent housing, because you have chronic homeless, you have situational homeless, displaced, you have people who opt in full-time, people who opt in seasonally. My guess is you would consider folks who live in school buses to be a part of this community, even though I know friends who do that, and I wouldn't consider them, you know, on the same place in that spectrum. Anyway, this is the email that I wrote, and I do want to read this into the record because I would like some comments on it, and I'll paraphrase. So I'd come across this article, this prompted some open-minded thinking, and here's the current situation as I laid it out. The city and county, and through conversation, private landowners sit on acres of available land that are not in use during our tourism period, or sometimes year-round. And we have seen an increase in the number of members of our workforce, particularly who rely on vehicles for housing. It's not just members of our workforce, though. It's also people with children in the schools. It's parents who don't work but have children and who are residents of town. And we have seen overwhelming demand in areas that previously had been used by workforce members who rely on this use, such as in the Willow Springs area. And we have seen the horrible effects of the lack of safe parking areas in the crimes last summer. And we are dealing with abuse of the system by the increase of van lifers visiting the area. And we don't have an easy way to distinguish between local use and visitor use. So it's hard to enforce, it's hard to provide services to our residences. Sorry, my kids are talking in the back. And the cost of gas will continue to burden workers who must live and park far from work. This may have the effect of driving up wages further, with all those wage gains going to gas and vehicle maintenances, perpetuating local inflation, exacerbating our worker shortage, and enforcement of illegal camping continues to be a constraint. what if, and here's just the again, this is brainstorming session is the name. What if the city or the county were able to use this vacant land, private land, to provide workforce housing for mobile dwellings throughout these busy months, potentially including places like, and I listed some options of, places in town. This is not a permanent or even semi-permanent solution. It could stem the bleeding if you give us a tool. So loose thinking. I'm just going to lay this out really quickly. A potential option. What if workforce members living in mobile dwellings could prove their employee's status through a pay stub or note from their employer, or have kids registered in the schools, for example, to be eligible for some kind of sticker designation to help us identify locals versus visitors by use. It could be placed on the vehicle and designate the vehicle as a temporary mobile dwelling, which is interesting as we talk about, temporary mobile permits, since there's a requirement that it always be on site. I don't know. The sticker would be good for 2 to 3 months, at which point the person would need to go into the city or county building to get a new one. Maybe you change the color monthly. And when you register your vehicle, give it to residents for free. It doesn't have to cost anything. It can be a very nominal fee. Each sticker could have a unique number logged with the name of the vehicle owner to counter fraud or a secondhand market. Anyone found allowing others to use their sticker would lose eligibility. This would reduce the burden on law enforcement as well in a simple sweep of areas of under popular use, since this kind of designation would allow the law enforcement to distinguish legal use and reduce conflict and interaction between law enforcement and the public. So it would allow us to also creatively enforce, regulate, move around the visitor use, less disturbance as well. Now, I realize, and as I said, these are broad brushstrokes of an idea. There's probably a lot in what I just read that's really, really bad. And I'm going to acknowledge that, because we need to put bad ideas on the table as well as good ideas in order to find the right ideas. But I wanted to open this up. I've been talking for a little while, because what we want to do is brainstorm. And I'm going to invite everyone to, because I just gave a bunch of ideas that could be really bad, breaking the ice. Please share good and bad ideas. What we'd like to do is actually come up with a suite of potential tools and have staff start to form it into something we can work with. Tony, I see your hand.
Yeah, Emily, I like where you're going. I like where your head's at. And acknowledging that this is not a permanent solution to our housing problem, as much as this is a solution to a parking issue. It sounds like your plan is just, this is not a criticism, just going halfway towards parking enforcement, which is what we should have in Moab. Residents with a job or a child registered in school should just get a parking pass. And we could enforce parking otherwise. I used to live in the neighborhood around Swanee Park, and it's mind-boggling. That's just one example. That's more city issue than county issue, I understand. Same thing with Moab Town Rail. I know John and I are working out whatever's going on down there. But it's a parking issue is what we're really talking about when we get into vehicles with engines and wheels and license plates. So I'd say let's just I don't know if this is what the Planning Commission does, but let's just take it all the way. And if we're going to go that far, let's just go to enforced parking, Yeah.
I actually appreciate the way you frame that, because, when we talk about things like enforcing illegal camping in our neighborhoods, which Rick raised as a, potential concern if we looked into temporary mobile dwellings, for example, in the county. Well, it's a lot easier to enforce what is and isn't an illegal use if the legal uses are monitored, registered, and regularly, permitted and inspected by different county groups. And I think one of the big issues I hear, and it's a real concern, is people who would like to see increased enforcement say, well, but we don't want to enforce our locals who have to live out of their vans. We don't want to do a sweep of Swanee Park if that catches 4 people who don't have a home to go home to. So this is a potential tool in a toolbox of options that could help ease the issue of enforcement, visibility, recognition, which includes also the ability to solve and provide humane solutions for folks. But I think also is a step towards the bigger question of, is there a reason to do this, not just by the vehicle, but also to consider some type of maybe employer land owned group parking with very specific standards, safety regulations, and so on.
Can I jump in with one more thing?
Kind
of playing on the parking thing, and to reiterate why I think paid parking would be so valuable here, is that there are a lot. Okay, I moved to Moab to be a raft guide because we have a 9-month rafting season here. It's the longest in the geographic regions you can choose to do that kind of work. Because I'm a bureaucrat at heart, after 6 months, I established residency in Utah because that's what the state law says I have to do. I registered my car. That gives us much better census data. That gives us much better tax roll information. That gives us much better population data. A lot of seasonal workers choose not to take that step because it's the man. And that really, like, we're only hurting ourselves when those numbers aren't being calculated. So if we could incentivize seasonal workers to register and establish residency in Moab when they're working into that zone and where they're supposed to establish residency here, the trickle-down effects from that would be incredibly valuable, just from a data perspective. Little soapbox real quick, but that's been bothering me for years.
I agree with it. Some kind of registration or like indication with the county / city that somebody's living and working here seasonally would be very helpful. I do want to say that I don't think registering your vehicle is something we're ever going to get most people to do. I have friends who've lived here for 2 years and they're like, oh, well, I go home for the winter or I go blah, blah, or whatever. And they can't be bothered to change their license plates. I'm not advocating for this, but I think the reality is a lot of people don't want to deal with A, the fees of changing over, and B, with just doing it. I think people can be bothered. I think something like what Emily was suggesting, some kind of registration, like, colleges do it all the time. There's stickers, like I always had to get a new sticker. You get fined if you don't have an up-to-date sticker, blah, blah, blah. It's very simple. It's pretty affordable and it's not hard to do. So people aren't going to be deterred to be like, oh, I don't get any license plates. I don't get a new registration. I don't get blah, 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 blah. It's like, okay, go to the county. I provide them with my stub. I get a sticker. Yeah. We're all good. Exactly. No, exactly. And I think that would be a good alternative because like, yeah.
I'll add, if this had any legs, it also has the potential of being a revenue stream because if during busy weekends, we may, and again, this is more in Moab City, but we do have places in the county where we have intense use. The power dam, the town bridge, various areas that are owned by the county. And especially with these van lives, remember, van life is the only overnight accommodation that requires parking and we don't regulate. So, we could potentially, once we know who is part of the residential residency or workforce, everyone else is now in this category that we have to manage. Let them buy a weekly permit for $25 from the information center and provide zone parking on busy weekends at our parks for up to 3 hours. I mean, I went down to Rotary Park to walk on the parkway, and there was a camper, and they had stacked something underneath the wheel to even it out so that they could rest and work on their bike and feed their dogs. I'm like, man, I get it, but it's our parks. I can't take my kids to the park because you want to take a nap at my park. Like, how can we turn this into something that makes the tourism economy support the tourism economy, doesn't create a burden on local residences, and allows us to differentiate between user groups so that we can manage them differently. We can manage our workforce given the tools that they need to be safe and to create a thriving workforce here, and then allows us also to provide services, but in a more intentional way to our visiting population.
You can set up just like the St. Pal or any of these other places, and it's just a kiosk you walk up to and you buy your permit.
Well, an hourly.
And then just an annual permit for locals.
We don't have, I can think of, I can count on one hand the number of places we have that are hourly parking and they're not enforced anyway
Okay.
at all. There's no enforcement, there's no, and I live 1 block, 2 blocks from Swanee Park, and I go past Swanee Park every day on my way to work. And it's the same people there all day, every day, from like 7 a.m. until midnight. You know what I mean? And it's, people have their dogs in the park, which they're not supposed to do. There's been human waste in the park multiple times, lots of human waste, like not in the bathrooms. Right. There's a ton of issues happening right now, and I think this is a really great conversation we're having. But I think someone kind of kiosk at our parks that are really hot parking destinations, like some kind of paid situation.
And I think this would be a partnership with the city.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The issue.
And I don't mean I'm getting into the.
No, but I think it's the right conversation because we're feeling it everywhere. We're feeling it in our neighborhoods. We're feeling it in our parks. We're feeling it in our campgrounds. We're feeling it in our hikes.
I actually just had this conversation with Curly Castle at Swanee Park before I came here.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Well, there you go.
Maybe a lot of apartments. Yeah, we just pay for the permit.
I don't know. I guess the structure of this feels a little loosey, so I'm getting into the weeds. Please let me know. But we've talked briefly about the option of having a spot where people who are working in our workforce can park their vans and use it as essentially an RV park kind of situation, but without. No, totally, of course. Yeah, of course. No. I think the problem is that if it was set up like an RV park, people wouldn't use it because RV parks are expensive. The whole allure of a van life is that you're not having all these expenses. You have your van. So
think about the economics of it.
Exactly.
Because they set up these skate parks, but they're still charging a certain amount that's not gonna be.
it would have to be subsidized. It would have to be a one-way out.
Sorry, I'm looking at the mic. Just really quick, Patricia. Tony, is this improved? I'm trying to troubleshoot.
Yeah, I haven't had any problems in maybe the last 20 minutes.
Okay, sorry, we missed your chat and I just didn't want to. Okay.
No, it's been better.
Okay.
I know, I think I sent you that article. They allowed camping last year in Telluride in the city park during the winter, right? They did charge, but it wasn't, it was like $300 or something. The reality is, like, if you put in infrastructure, you're going to have to pay for that infrastructure. And so, I think if it's a small fee, to me, is $100 a week is a pretty small fee when baseline wages right now are $20 an hour, to start anywhere, right? I understand.
Right.
But people aren't camping in the desert, they're
Yeah,
camping.
sorry, because we have people on the conference, let's make sure that we.
Yeah, I get
There's-
what you're saying.
We have a lot of workforce people living out in Yellow Circle right now. There were a lot in Willow Springs. And as soon as Willow Springs turns into the state park, then they're just gonna move to Valley City.
Right.
Or Klondike. Or health department wise, Tony's small ones, like we're struggling with human waste in the desert big time. We have a lot of grant money and I'm looking to hire another person to work on that. And so just in number from the health department, like we have been, I've talked to the city about it too, but we're trying to figure out putting in a scan machine for first to be cleaned out in. We have $65,000 towards one of those right now. And as well as a place to put wag bags, as well as an additional RV is something that we're working on to help with that stuff that's happening in the desert that is just going to get compounded. But if the city and county want to team up and try to build one of this parking area, it's obviously got to be cheaper than fuel. Because otherwise people just live in the desert. And then we just need to build it to, I would build it to a dependent vehicle. Recreational vehicle standard, provide the bathhouse, provide the toilets, all of that. And then probably like an RV dump where people can dispose of their waste, but without having all that other stuff necessarily.
Yeah, is there, I mean, I understand, So obviously money's not free. We can't just like offer these things without any kind of income from it, but there is a lot of grant funding. There is a lot of public funding. I mean, we have many other like social nets for things in our community. Would it be practical to have something like a designated parking area with a bathroom, with maybe a rustic bathroom, with a rustic shower, with these basic things, pet waste disposal, all these things. Spots where you can park your van, a little spot to hang out. We're using the parking passes, maybe something along the lines of what you described, and with that, you get entrance into this park. You pay that, you can use this park in town or nearby town and come and go. If there's a spot open, you just pull in, you use it, and then you pull out and you pay the fee every month or 3 months or whatever to use it. And it's maybe subsidized by grant funding or by some other kind of funding.
So let me take this and just redirect into the few paths. So there's a conversation about recognition, enforcement, parking, permitting, which I actually think it's the right way to think about it, Tony. Then there's this question about, but where? So option one is, make our parking lots available to, it sounds like there's not interest for that. I've heard a lot of people say that's not the right direction. It's going to be, you have to build the infrastructure anyway. So there's two other things, and maybe there's more, but there's two other things that I'd love to direct the conversation around. They're similar. The first is, in our land use code today, a campground is an overnight accommodation overlay designated use. And we don't distinguish between, we don't have the concept of campgrounds that are deeded for workforce housing. Although we do have one project that is not deed restricted. So it's allowed to operate just as an RV park, but when the application came before us, the intent the developer gave us was, I need a place to be able to let people in my industry camp. They named it following that use and so on, but it's not, there's no enforcement of that actually being the use. So question one is, do we want to direct staff to explore the possibility of splitting our definition of a campground, keeping our current OAO just what it is, but also looking at the possibility of, well, what if there's a campground that could be owned by a public group, it could be owned by a nonprofit, it could be owned by, someone, and let it operate as a campground, but restrict it to workforce use, right? Long-term, of some designation, workforce use, with the requirement of all of the other things that you require of a campground or an RV park. And then related to that is we have this question of employers who want to provide housing to their employees. And in that case, they aren't operating commercially. They are operating seasonally. They don't, the use will vary even throughout the season. And we're seeing this question of it. Employers want to provide this to be able to create stable workforce. In many cases, they're doing it anyway, illegally. I know of that happening, as I'm sure you do, Orion, because it happens. And then, they want to be in compliance. They want to be able to provide a place for their employees to live, but their employees might be in a tent, in a car, in RV, and so on. Where I'd love to go with this is just, are there any other options we should be talking about in terms of like direction for staff to potentially explore? And are there specific things we should be discussing, parameters we'd like to see included and so on? Trisha?
Don't we already have,
We started on exactly what you're
The
saying.
draft in the packet, so maybe that's where we lead
We're
to.
starting
don't
on
we already have existing code regarding employees having the ability
on-site, on their
on-site?
actual,
Okay, gotcha.
where the business operates.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's very specific to business too.
Okay.
Because like Desert Hills Bed and Breakfast wanted to hire an additional person to help them and help them live in their RV, but they were denied that application for some reason because they were in non-conforming use.
Okay, so we need to revisit that. I mean, that would process it. Right.
I need to go, but my one comment on that is I'd be curious if the county were to open it up to where employers could build these things, if it wouldn't just solve the problem without the county having to put money into it. I can think of several smaller businesses that would do this.
Okay. Great. So we allow the employees. or
The employers to build
on site.
an RV park that's designated specific to their people.
Would it have to be at the same location that they could?
I don't think so.
That
I
would
can
be
think.
the- That would be the change, like, yeah, it's currently.
Yeah.
So we just have to modify
Sorry,
that.
guys. Oh,
Yeah, you still-
all of us are talking. Tony, Steve, and everyone online can't hear us.
Okay.
So,
I've got it around. Those are my comments.
Thank you so much for
If you need
joining
any more,
us.
let me know.
Okay, round robin, because I'm sorry, I cut all of you off. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Long term, that other side would be a nice place to use.
Everybody left and right is like.
I'm just gonna get subdivided into 1,000 parcels. It's
Yeah,
gonna be a
yeah.
thousand things.
Why not? I know it's one piece.
Yeah, the big piece. I still think it would be necessary to have some kind of publicly owned or nonprofit owned and not privately owned option for van lifers and other, because there are lots of remote workers working in their vans, a lot. We've had a huge influx. The Mark, when I was working at the Mark, we started a remote working spot for people to use, and I couldn't believe it. We didn't have enough space for people in our building to use it. Had 30 plus people trying to use our building, and we had to turn people away because that's not what that building's primarily for. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's a ton of van lifers who are working remotely. There's a ton of van lifers who are doing alternative work for small companies or for small organizations that don't have the means or the interest to build some kind of RV park. Well, there is, I still think it's super necessary because of,
That's just quickly on that note. When I say no for your employer or pay stub, I mean employer based in Grand County or
Absolutely.
San Juan County,
Correct.
not.
I agree.
great, yeah.
And that would
Yeah.
be a big differentiation to know in setting this up, because folks that are working remotely, they might be able to afford something a little bit more than the person who's the river guy.
And maybe there's different pricing for that.
Right, yeah, yeah, sliding scale,
Yeah,
the situation, right.
Before Trish, I pass to you, Tony. Oh, muted.
Muted.
Every time, never fails. I was picking up on what you were saying while I was Googling various rules, etc. And I'm once again just going to take it one step further. If we were to seriously consider developing or allowing some kind of use like this, one, I think, yeah, absolutely, this should be allowed. But going back on our ADU conversation, this can't be a tent city. You know, these facilities, just like Orion described, with their health standards and all that, running water, other things that are required for housing that aren't necessarily required for camping are like a place to cook food. You need a stovetop in order to rent a housing unit. It needs to have a range. That's stuff that needs to be provided, communal kitchen space. If we were to have any sort of publicly subsidized version of this, it would absolutely need to be board driven. Board driven, just like us, the planning commission, it'd be board. Yeah, board driven, like an NGO or something like that. And like community rebuilds, it should prioritize greatest need, right? Just because if the reason your Sprinter van isn't registered in Utah is because your dad in Amherst, Massachusetts owns it, that shouldn't be like, maybe you could just, use dad's money and get a rental, right? It should be need driven. And there should be some sort of application and vetting process to make sure that the people who need the most help are getting it, is all.
I agree with that. And I think what we heard from Orion and what I'm hearing in the community and from county commissioners who sort of weighed in over the course of the months that this has been floating around, there's a lot of private interest in this. Like, I don't think that just because we're talking about the potential for some sort of public support, I actually don't think that needs to be, should be, or would be the thing that would drive the interest in us reviewing our code for employers, nonprofits, and so on to provide this use. I do think it's interesting to think about what a public approach to it could be, but I think those are all great comments, Tony.
And without implicating any specific industry in the public record, right? I can think of industry groups where, individual private businesses team up that have resources and an avenue that could implement something like this, that are already nonprofits, that are already board driven. So there's I wouldn't expect any single one private entity, any single guide company to undertake, building a campground facility for their own employees, but there are opportunities to get industry groups working together within themselves, right? And yeah, I like it being not a completely government program. I like it being more competitive that way. I would want people who are looking into living in a program like this to be able to consider what their best value is. I wouldn't want the county to come in and do this and then to stifle any other opportunity for housing that might come about. Workers should be able to, and this is a huge problem we have in Moab, right, is that workers cannot leverage their best value housing against other things because it's also sky high. And if we just monopolize affordable housing, it's not going to be affordable anymore.
Are you advocating for, are you saying you prefer solely privately owned situation, or are you saying you would just like to see diversification, that there would be publicly and privately owned?
I would like a mosaic. Yeah. Not solely privately owned, of course not, but I would like there to be a mosaic. I'd like it to be competitive.
And just to call out, I mean, it would start with the code. It would start with the land use code, and that's our opportunity here. And then, in that, provide recommendations, a vision, a possible arc for how this could evolve. But this would be Title 10, Title 5, and that this would be far beyond. And any further conversation of this was fine with Christina, just because the code-based conversation is one thing. I just want to be mindful. All of this is ideation. Absolutely. Coming up with ideas to bring back to the people. So just really big, giant block letters that say caveat above all of our heads.
I mean, when we're talking about disposing of some of these lands and we just kind of talk about these basic ideas, this gives us a vision, right? And we've already brought up, and that's what I was doing. I wasn't trying to be rude looking at my phone. I was looking at my Onyx. But so you were doing too. But Grant County does have this parcel of land on Murphy Lane, right by the bowling alley, and that's a rough spot. The topography isn't great, but it's that's pretty close to town, right? It's really close to a bike path, right? So, and that was a spot that we had talked about. What can we put there for workforce housing? And so that's a pretty. I mean, it drives that idea of can we dispose of some of that land and use that money for that? Right, putting in some basic infrastructure that would go to the bathhouses.
I mean, if you're doing that, that also provides in the future, you could be actually a lot more permanent housing.
Right.
Change this, build
Right.
everything else here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, limited infrastructure.
Steve, I want to give you a chance to weigh in, and then we'll get notes from Elisa, any questions she has that she needs us to answer to let staff go forward, and then I think we'll move on. So, Steve, any other comments? Okay, all right. We threw a lot at you.
That's okay. I hope it's all good. It's all pertinent and stuff that, has been talked about. Kind of just, this is a great brainstorming extension of things that are already being put into motion. And I think for the first thing that I'm focusing on is really that initial strategy, which is to build into our code something that would allow a private property owner to develop some kind of a long-term camp park So starting with the private sector, and then we can start figuring out how the public.
But again, it's all like workforce housing based, right?
Right, yeah, so it would be deed restricted, can't park fully for workforce housing, it wouldn't be allowed for overnight rentals, it would be all, they would all be hooked up to the utilities, and it would be, starting with the, I've already started kind of working with the OAO section and kind of changing it to fit a long-term camp park. And so one of the things in there that I noticed is that they allow, and we already allow for overnight accommodations, the different types of dwellings, like you can do an RV, you can do a KOA style cabin, which to me just kind of sounds like a tiny home. And so I was just talking with Kevin too a little bit about this just before the meeting, is that there really could be a mix of these different types of dwellings within one camp park. We wouldn't have to necessarily pigeonhole like this is only for RVs, but it could be whatever kind of market driven thing happens.
Would vans be allowed in this scenario?
Right. Yes. Yeah, and so wherever a van would be allowed in a camp park, then you would, and it doesn't have its own bathroom and bath, then you would be building a bathroom.
A van is a tent.
Yeah.
Totally, I said she had to.
Yeah.
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 Right.
I know we're not allowed to rent control in Utah. Might be a little tragic, but what kind of leeway do we have for incentivizing people in these scenarios? I just keep coming back to the same issue that I'm really concerned about is employer-owned housing taking advantage of their employees. You're working for your employer, your living situation is controlled by your employer. Everything about your life essentially is in the hands of your employer, and it doesn't necessarily have to go sour, but there's potential for that, and I'm curious what safeguards we could offer or incentives we could offer to employers to offer affordable rent, some kind of tools for employees in these situations. I'm just curious what we have to work with those. Yeah, just something to prioritize. Yeah, there's something to prioritize, I think, because
I mean, the only way I can think to make it more affordable too is when we get into thinking about having the county or the city involved subsidizing the right of land and then write it into the or somehow offsetting the cost, but it doesn't have to be so expensive. I mean, just given what Orion was sharing about the regular limiting of mobile dwellings, this would fall under that same category. And so if there were long-standing, it's in the employer's interest to have housing for their employees as much as for the employees. And so an employer who was held to not just standards of cleanliness, which any mobile dwelling, but then also certain standards. Yeah, and what would be required? That would be part of that.
Right. Yeah, I get you. I feel like part of this for me is also like, yes, affordability is important, but also encouraging people to use this as opposed to saying F this and going up the desert. Right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. It's like trying to, and maybe the private sector, that's not the space for it, right? I don't think it is.
Yeah.
That would be the public option would be, that would be what was trying to go. That would be interesting to see balance those things.
I'm really glad to bring that up though, and I've used this word a few times now, opportunity is intentionally. You need to think about making this, think about the dignity of this. What we are not exploring is some other this category for housing for people who can't afford to buy homes in America. This is granting people the dignity to be able to live where they work, develop paths that lead to future options, reduce suffering, reduce the anxiety of not knowing where to park, especially for people like more at risk, safety issues. So I'm really glad you raised that. I think it's important we should continue to talk about this in terms of respecting the dignity of the people, not just solving the workforce problem.
myself the final word, but let's do this. I'm just gonna do a really quick playback of what we covered, just kind of, circle the thing, final call, and then we'll move on to future considerations. Okay, so regarding Article 3.3.2, you have the draft language. Email any additions to staff. Staff will track changes just like we did with the general plan. We'll review the track changes at our next meeting. There's some urgency with this one just because of the updated state code. So we want to keep this ball rolling. And based off of the consensus discussion, I think the staff is not going to move forward in looking at temporary dwellings as an alternative under that 3.3.2 for ADUs. So just marking that one. Okay, been a long day. As far as this discussion item 4, so some of the things that we covered were just one, identifying which user group different vehicles fit into. The potential is this like permitting idea proposed. I'm sure there are lots of other ways of approaching it. That's one. Also has the ability of creating a revenue stream for the, let's just call it the resident user group. Some of the things that we've discussed are looking at a campground classification that is specific to workforce housing, largely basing that on the assumption of employer housing, nonprofit housing options, potentially opening up the possibility that the city or county might be interested in this, but we can define the use and let the groups come to it. And then there's this question of, temporary zone designation usage that's more temporary and tight for the visiting user class, the people who are the van lifers, getting them out of our neighborhoods, increasing enforcement, knowing where they are, knowing the problem will disperse the desert if we don't solve it, especially on busy weekends. This gives us the tools to start to play around with that. I think it would be great, maybe a month from now or 6 weeks from now, seeing if the city planning commission or even if Carly would be interested in having a member of her staff come and talk to us about this forward. I also would be glad to have Christina join. Not our next meeting, this is already a lot, but looking at some next topics. Okay. Any other comments? Or even fine. Yes. Yeah. Rick has another idea.
There's still a lot of single land south of town, and could you leverage transient room tax to develop something? Because transient stuff, motels and that kind of stuff, are generating that money while a lot of these people work in those places. So, so maybe you can, I don't know, I remember there's been a lot of back and forth on that, but that could come up as some kind of development, and certainly may go along with something like that, but there is a bunch of civil land out there.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Okay, let's move on to, so we covered 5, so let's move on to our public open houses this week.
Yeah, so that's just a plug for that happening on Wednesday and Thursday. So the Wednesday one is down at Gwissa, and then and that's from 4 to 6, and then the very next day is the same open house workshop, but it's at the Grand Center. So we're just trying to get the northern part of the county, or the valley, and the southern part of the county, and hopefully get a lot of folks to come to those. And it's mostly what we're going to have Bill there presenting the scenario planning stuff, and then opening it up for neighborhood planning, just kind of a getting people's ideas and concerns, kind of just a listening session. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Grand County Connects. Although I don't know if I consider that.
Yeah, it's on Facebook. It's been on Facebook. Yeah, and we've had some strategy towards like helping to add.
Fabulous.
Yeah, do you
I've
use
seen it.
Instagram?
What's that?
Do you use Instagram?
I don't know if we do. I don't think we do, but we should.
A lot of our younger population, like
Yeah.
my age and
for sure.
is really active on Instagram. Now
Too.
we're stop and
Yeah.
but it is really, I mean, unfortunately, some people it is like the way that a lot of people share information.
I think we should do an Instagram account.
Actually, that's what I just want to do is to go share it on my Instagram. story.
Okay.
A lot of information for people.
Maybe we can get one going real quick.
Yeah, I love that.
No, it's not a picture instead, but just yeah.
So that should be good. We'll keep you posted on the results of that at the next meeting. The scope of work from BAE, they did send us something at the end of last week, and John and I are just reviewing it. I just wanted to let you guys know that we're kind of status of that, where we're at is just looking at that scope of work and figuring out what we need to do to tweak it and make it more suitable, but we'll bring it, I'm sure, to a meeting soon.
Quickly on that, I was back in 2018 or 19, there was a draft economic report that I don't think ever made it into adoption, but it had some just mind-boggling statistics, things like laying out a firefighter and a teacher couldn't afford this. They could afford one house that was sold that entire year in Grand County, and that was years ago. I couldn't find it online. I know it'd be updated.
Yeah.
Could you look in the archives and see if you could find a copy of that and distribute it to the
Yeah,
planning?
for sure. They originally did their studies in 2017. I think it might have gone into 2018 a little bit, but they did a phase 1 and a phase 2, and one of them was an economic analysis.
Maybe it was that. I couldn't remember if it was
Yeah.
internal or them, but
I'll forward you those.
Thank you.
If that was it. But then, they were gonna give us kind of an update on current trends and then, go into the housing solutions. See.
Tony wants to see it too. I might have a copy somewhere. Or there were other commissioners, OB might have a copy, but
Yeah, I have it on Google Drive. There's a folder that has a bunch of that stuff in there and their original studies in there. So I'll send that out.
get Tony's workers a wage. Okay. Yes.
And I kind of already said this, and I know it comes back to the rent control thing. I'm just curious. We found creative ways to work with legislatively prohibited things and work with the rules that we have. Just curious if some research can be done or if we have answers on this of ways to incentivize people on affordable rent. Or you know what I mean, like for these things that we're building, there's affordable housing we're building, there's all these things. I'm just curious. Especially mostly in these are requiring, we're saying, okay, you have to build employee housing. I've heard of, I'm not gonna name business but some people saying, work for this business, yeah, they have employee housing, it's not practical. Like, I could pay to live there, but it's not practical for my living costs. So the business is meeting the standard, but it's really not. So I'm just curious if we have any way to have anything in that situation. Sure not. There's a lot of this.
Right now,
Sure.
state legislature really.
Yeah, and I don't wanna like
For the city.
instigate some more, but yeah.
For the state.
Yeah, and I understand that's a really sensitive issue, but I'm
I
just
mean, one
curious.
thing I keep hoping and thinking is that in the future, when you see all the HHO units built out, and there's 80% of those being restricted for locals, that they could be
Really pressure.
sort of
have to.
creating a little market. Sure. Well, that was the idea, was the secondary market.
Yeah.
It would be a lot more.
Right.
Great. Great. Yeah, and I understand like the legislature causes a lot of limitations for us, and so it's just, I just wanted to. bring that up.
I think, there is something. That's an interesting.
I thought of it, somebody brought it up to me, they're like, oh, I work for this person, and it's kind of a joke, so that's why I was.
I mean, for me, it's because we need tax incentives, county give tax incentives for keeping rentals affordable. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And creative thinking.
That's,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Sorry, one last thought on this, separate but related. One of the things that we have to reckon with is that we just don't have a lot of data about what's happening inside of our boundaries, our county boundaries. So for example, like I raised people saying, we should enforce the bans at our parks, but we don't want to penalize our workers.
Yeah.
You know, here's another example. We say we have the potential for employer housing, but we don't want employers making money off of their employees. This is a question more for Chris Barrett and the county commission. It's not, you know, but it would help us give better recommendations to have some understanding of what's happening. So for example, if the county sheriff were to do a month of enforcement of vans and just go down and knock on every single window of every single van that's parked illegally in our county, not to cite, but to learn, or potentially it's something that a group such as the planning and zoning could do, and go and talk to 1,000 people and learn how many of those 1,000 people are visitors from Amherst, Massachusetts, and how many of those people are
Yeah.
right, because then we can make more informed decisions. And similarly, you know, is there a way for us to anonymously poll employees about, are you living in workforce housing or not, or housing applied by your employer? What is your living situation? Have you worried about where to live sometime in the last week? What are you paying? What portion of your wages? That kind of data would be really, it'd be difficult to come by, but there are groups in town, Seek Haven, Multicultural
Yeah.
Center, worker services that can help us.
Yeah.
We have good luck also, like I would personally volunteer.
Yeah. Oh, I would too.
Like 100%, I would
Yeah.
be like, yep, I'll talk to people and have to do that.
So I would like
To
to ask.
me, this is a university, I don't know, it's almost like, could a university, could a grad student,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right. Well, that'd be
we
very cool.
should maybe could contact Wayne. Let me talk to him.
Would you take that on?
Yeah.
Can I designate this to you? Okay. Trish is gonna solve that.
Yeah.
Okay. Any last comments,
Solve
future
it.
considerations? Great. All right. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Rick, moves to adjourn. Second.
I'll second.
Second by McKenna. All in favor. All right. Fabulous. Steve, I'm assuming you can hear us. Steve says yes. That's unanimous. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye, Steve. Bye, Tony. Thank you.